Hello. Here we are in week 4, the second of our 2 classes on the books of Samuel. We're going to look at some general things about the book and then also about the 2 books, both First and Second Samuel, emphasizing again the fact that First and Second Samuel, like First and Second Kings that we're starting next week, is in fact a single work divided into 2 for practical reasons, because the length of the book makes a single scroll too unwieldy and really too heavy to manage it. It pulls itself to pieces. Um, okay, something that synagogues have been struggling with for centuries. Um, we got to the 3rd page of the notes on the books of Samuel. Before we continue with that, let me say something quickly about where we've come so far, because I want to emphasize something in particular about the books of Samuel, and I want to remind you of the fact that this is not unusual. Um, we began with Joshua, of course, and one of the things I tried to show you about the book of Joshua is that the book of Joshua has been very frequently misunderstood and misread by people, um, continuing up into the current day, the modern period, because people sit down and assume that the book of Joshua is a story of conquest, and so therefore they argue with it as being in an unsuccessful and inappropriate story of the conquest of the children of Israel over Palestine, and then they argue with the um, archaeological information, which is not all that great, that we have about Palestine at that period, saying it doesn't match what the book says. As I tried to tell you during the first 2 classes, the book very clearly does not present a picture of the children of Israel conquering Palestine, but rather of them conquering quite small areas in the hill country in what is now Palestine, which is a very different thing. And that, as a matter of fact, the tales told there fit with the very sparse information that we have from archaeology about that period, and as a matter of fact set up very well for the book of Judges, which is clearly the story of the children of Israel living up in the hills while the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, are controlling the lowlands with their chariots of iron. So I argued, and this is not just me, this is lots of people, I argued that one of the great barriers to proper understanding of Joshua has been people's preconceptions about what the book was going to be about before they pick it up. This is the book of conquest, right? So then they open it up and look for conquest, and it's not there. So then they complain. Judges, I also tried to argue, is not just, and I'm going to say this also about 2 Samuel, but I'll run, that's why I'm going through this. Judges, I argued, is not just a collection of stories about the judges. That, as a matter of fact, if you think about the concept of major and minor judges, which we looked at in the notes, that is a matter of, that is a division, an artificial division made by scholars between judges about whom there are lots of stories and judges about whom there are fewer stories. It says absolutely nothing at all about how important they actually were in history for the children of Israel, which is something which is very difficult for us to figure out. I pointed out also the fact that there's good reason to think that we are not supposed to think of the judges as ruling over all of the tribes of Israel, but rather of being tribal chiefs of particular parts of the people, and that because of that there's no particular reason to think that they could not have been functioning more than one at the same time. And I argued, along with the help of that outline that I sent to you, that full page outline, that what we are actually being presented with in the book of Judges is a very selective and carefully shaped choice of information about that period, which is designed to give a very particular sense of that period to the reader who pays attention. And that the general message of the book is that, is the Deuteronomic message that we started with in the first class. When you do what you're supposed to do, the Lord your God looks after you, and when you don't do what you're supposed to do, bad things happen. And that the book is constructed to begin with a period of increasing success when the children of Israel do what they're supposed to do, which sort of peaks with Gideon, who is also the beginning of the downfall, naming his child Abimelech, which you're not supposed to do if you're not a king, and going on from there until you end up with the 4 or 5 chapters at the end of the book, which are complete disaster, where the children of Israel are massacring each other and then massacring other Jews in order to be able to marry off their surviving virgin daughters to the survivors of the first massacre. Not at all what the Lord has in common, not appropriate behavior for the children of Israel. And then you have the trouble with the priest descended from Moses, being sort of bought by the people from Dan. All of that inappropriate behavior is really meant to be very clear that the book ends with the children of Israel failing to keep the covenant. Then we get to Samuel, and as I'm going to argue here, let's look quickly. I'm on page 4 of the notes. Let's look very quickly at the prayer of Hannah, which is in the 2nd chapter of 1 Samuel, and the Song of David, the Psalm of David, which is contained in the 22nd chapter of 2 Samuel, reminding you of the fact that this is a single work. Right? This is why I said last week, you must think of the books of Samuel and, for the next 2 weeks, Kings, as a single work, or you cannot understand them properly. Just because we divide it and say first book of Kings, second book of Kings, first book of Samuel, second book of Samuel, does not mean that these are actually separate works. They are not. We are splitting something which is unified into 2 for practical purposes that have to do with the size of scrolls. And you must keep that in mind. But anyway, before I make my general point about the books of Samuel, let's actually look at what we see about the books of Samuel. Okay, we go back to the beginning of the first book of Samuel, and the very first thing we see is, there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah. The beginning of the story of the miraculous birth of the prophet Samuel, right? We left the children of Israel in self-inflicted disaster at the end of the books of Judges. The first thing that's happening in Samuel is we're getting the backstory, as we would say in Hollywood, where I have never been. I'm still waiting to be discovered, so maybe this video will be it. The backstory behind the birth of Samuel, who is going to be, in important ways, the central character in this book, if it's properly understood, right? His wife, whose name means grace, has no child. As you know, she's one of 2 wives. The other wife has children. She has no children. She prays to the Lord, right? And this is her prayer here, beginning in the second part of the first verse of the 2nd chapter of 1 Samuel. My horn exults in the Lord. My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The Lord knows what you're doing. Right? That's what it means by being a God of knowledge. The bows of the mighty are broken. The feeble bind on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, and those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, many, and she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He leaves the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes, inherit a seat of honor. I won't read you the whole thing. It ends with, the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. We're going to get kings and anointed people more than once in this book. As the notes here on page 4 point out, as Hamilton points out, in the first, a barren woman is blessed with a child, and she responds. As he points out, there is not a single petition in this prayer. It is a prayer of praise, not asking for a child. It is a prayer of faith in the Lord. And because she has faith in the Lord grants her what she desires, but she does not ask for what she desires. Why does she need to ask? After all, he's a God of knowledge, right? It's not like he doesn't know that she wants a child. If you turn to Psalm 113, why not do it since we're sitting here studying the Bible, right? I will read you some of Psalm 113. This is all, I'm still in my ESV study Bible, as I said before, so none of these things sound the way. I'm afraid that I may be the last, the youngest person who was raised on the King James Bible, but I'm just old enough so I was raised, and even in school, I'm old enough so we read in school from the Bible, and we always read from the King James Bible. I can't remember how old I was before I knew there were other Bibles. I always knew that it was a translation from other languages, but I don't remember when I came in contact with other Bibles, college or after college. I don't know. Anyway, and I was from Massachusetts. That shows you how the world has changed. It wasn't like I was from the hills of Kentucky. Okay, Psalm 113. Praise the Lord, praise, O servants of the Lord, praise the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord from this time forth forevermore, from the rising of the sun to its setting. It really starts in verse 7. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with the princes of his people. He gives the barren woman a home, making her the joyous mother of children. Praise the Lord. So that's what's reminiscent of the Song of Hannah. But then, of course, the Magnificat, my soul doth magnify the Lord, my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior, for he hath regarded the lowliness of his handmaiden. For behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. He that is mighty hath magnified me, and holy is his name. It's always interesting, I think, when I'm in the chapel at the seminary, to hear, a group of men in black robes singing this song, the Mother's Thanksgiving song. It just shows that the scripture as used, and like the Psalms as used, because it's a psalm, even though it's a New Testament psalm, the Psalms as used are used by the faithful people much more broadly than they originally occur. So I've never thought that it was inappropriate for me to sing Mary's song, even though I've always noticed that her situation in life is different from mine. So that is the beginning of this book. The children of Israel are in desperate case because that's where we left them at the end of Judges. Elkanah is this guy who's got 2 wives. One of his wives doesn't have children, and the Lord gives, the Lord gives her children, and they take him up to offer, right? And Hannah prays after he's offered a response. It's very interesting. The Lord gives her her heart's desire. She gives her heart's desire back to the Lord, and then she prays a prayer of praise to the Lord. I've never heard a sermon on Hannah as an Old Testament example of casting your bread upon the waters and you will receive it, multiplied. But she certainly is a woman of faith who did exactly that. I always find it we had trouble having children, my wife and I, and had all that we could, 3. And the the story, she goes up every year to take him a little robe and stuff, because he's grown and that kind of stuff. I always sort of pictured that, but that kind of stuff, I've never asked my wife how that seems to her, but that it cuts very deep with me now that I have 3 children, the youngest of whom is 21. But anyway, that's how the book starts. It starts with the Lord visiting, in biblical terms, visiting his people. He's seeing Hannah and her faith. He sees her need. He grants her heart's desire because of the kind of faithful woman she is, the kind who, to whom the Lord will give her heart's desire. She gives her heart's desire back. And this is, of course, there are a lot of things about Samuel that are echoes, but you would say anticipations of the life of Christ. The child being given to the faithful woman, and the woman turns and gives the child back to the Lord. She giving Samuel away as the little baby to the temple is not there. There's a real sermon there comparing her to Mary at the foot of the cross. Mother, behold your son. Woman, behold your son. Man, behold your mother. He takes care of her after he's gone with the beloved disciple. There's a real parallel there, which is one reason why Christian devotion to Samuel and Hannah has been strong. But that's how the book begins. So the Lord is present and active with the faithful people among Israel, when we have just seen in the book before that Israel as a collection of tribes had fallen apart and fallen away from the Lord. But has the Lord really given up on Israel? No. The Lord continues to take care of his faithful people, like Hannah and Samuel. Okay, that's how the book begins. So the assumption the intelligent reader should make is that despite what the children of Israel did, repudiating the covenant as strongly as they could, massacring each other, and then massacring to make up for the massacre, which I don't need to point out to you all, you're not allowed to do, the Lord is still there, and still granting the faithful people their requests. So then we go all the way to 2 Samuel chapter 22, where we get the elderly David. This is the elderly David. Very important to remember. The elderly David, he's not only already, defeated Goliath, but he's already done all of the sinful things like murdering Uriah the Hittite to get his beautiful wife away from him, and preferring his rebellious son Absalom to his faithful people who die fighting against Absalom on David's behalf, so that he has to be rebuked by his general, who is not, the most sensitive guy around, but he gets it clearly better than David does. After all of that, David clearly not a spotless saint, but someone who, as often as he strays, always comes back. David is a prototypical repentant man of faith. He sins and repents and sins and repents, and he really does repent, and then he really does sin, and then he really does repent, and then he really does sin. If there's a good Old Testament example of the spiritual logic behind repeated confession of sin, which the early church struggled with, the concept which the early church struggled with, it would certainly be David. And at the end of his life, right, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior. You save me from violence. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. He's had lots of problems in his life, and the book has shown them to you. So hiding in the caves and having to pretend to be crazy and drool down his beard, all that kind of stuff. In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice. My cry came to his ears. This again is a psalm of praise of the Lord for his character. Right? Verse 32. Who is God but the Lord? Who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge and has made my way blameless. He has made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. Right? Praise of the Lord is how it's very interesting. At the beginning of the book, the Lord visits his faithful servant Hannah and gives her the little baby Samuel, who is then offered back to the Lord for service in his temple. And she praises him. And at the end of the book, the hardly stainless saint David, but who is still in important ways the kind of archetypal Old Testament Jewish figure, King David, the great singer of praises, and the great winner of battles, as well as the sinner in all the ways that we've mentioned and a lot we haven't, praises the Lord too. And that is the framework of this book. The Lord is faithful at the beginning of the book, even when they'd spent all of Judges kicking him away, and he's faithful to David and recognized as such by David at the end of the book, even though David spent a lot of the intervening books of Samuel kicking him away too, right? So the children of Israel as a group kick him away in Judges. David does a lot of kicking away in Samuel. David, you read these things and you think, can the people in the period of Judges not figure out that when they are loving to the Lord and faithful to the Lord, that everything goes well for them? And then as soon as they stop being faithful to the Lord, everything falls apart. They can't figure that out. Here I am, 12 years old, reading the book for myself, in confirmation class, and I can figure it out, and I'm no great, theological genius. So what's their problem? But then, of course, David, who presumably knows the stories from the book of Judges, even if the book of Judges probably isn't written yet, at least not in the form that we have it. David knows the stories, and he certainly doesn't seem to have learned the lesson. There's something important about human nature being shown to us there. I'm not the first one to notice that. My mother, who was a churchgoer but not a great believer as far as I can tell, all of her life as a school teacher, she knew all about human nature. And it was not always a good thing as a child growing up to have your mother look at you and know what's going on inside your head, so that, like the Lord, she could punish you before you did stuff because she knew it was coming. Anyway. Maybe I'd be better off if she'd punished me more. But so that it's very important to have that pointed out to you, because if you read these as two books, you don't put those songs together. But they are the framework inside of which we are meant to understand all of the stories in between. All the Saul stuff, all the Samuel stuff, all the Eli stuff, all the David stuff. Let's kind of go backwards. If you look at the bottom of the third page of the notes, the last little bits of Satterthwaite and McConville, these questions. I really am a big fan of the series in which Satterthwaite and McConville appears, the name of which I can never remember. But, well, anyway, and it's not listed in the back, but it was listed in previous things of notes. These pages of questions are very intelligent. Is this work an apologetic for David and his house? It is certainly not an apologetic in the sense that it is a, as they said above on page 140, is this a whitewash? It's certainly not a whitewash in the sense of presenting David as a, you know, as a spotless knight. The book, if you look at the list of books on page 5, I know a woman who teaches Old Testament at Oxford, and who was the one who, I wrote to her and said, I want to read some things on, the current, this is about 10 years ago. I want to read some current books of the scholarly discussion about the historical accuracy and dependability of the Old Testament. So she sent me, a list of 15 books. So I read them because she told me to. And one of them is Baruch Halpern, David's Secret Demons, Messiah, Murderer, Traitor, King. Unconvincing but make you think is what she told me in her note. So that's what I was thinking about it. Halpern reads the books of Samuel and Kings, the David stuff, with the eye of someone who assumes it's a whitewash. So every time they're telling you something bad about David, he believes it. Every time they tell you something good about David, he says, no, that's obviously a lie. What's really is something else. And so he reads everything in as hostile a way to David as possible. And so, of course, it's really an attempt to, begin with the assumption that the story is a whitewash and reveal the true story by getting the whitewash out of it, and all you have is, the darkness underneath. And as she says, unconvincing but makes you think. You have to wonder, first of all, you have to wonder about the place of a figure like David in the history of Israel if he's really as bad as Halpern thinks he was. How does that work? And also, if it is a whitewash, why don't you, if I paint my house with whitewash, I paint the whole thing, right? If you're going to whitewash somebody's memory, why don't you make it all good instead of leaving it a very mixed picture? I hardly think the picture of David in the books of Samuel is, it seems to be a sort of an even mix of good and bad. I find it difficult to read it as a whitewash. I just think that, you can be very suspicious of the good stories and things, but I don't think you can claim that it's a whitewash. That doesn't make sense. So is it an apologetic for David and his house? It's certainly an apologetic in that it sets up David and the house of David as being the ruling family through whom the Lord wants to operate Israel, and whom the Lord thinks of as a necessary part of the whole operation. After all, descendants of David are on the throne in Jerusalem all the way down to the final collapse of the kingdom, and you could even say after, because the Babylonians put other descendants of David in as the local governors after the kingdoms are done away with, right? And the books support that because they say these are the guys who are supposed to do it. But I hardly think it's a whitewash, because these people are generally pretty bad. Even Solomon, who starts off, as well as you can, ends up mired in idolatry and stuff like that at the end. And if you read through the books of Kings, which we're going to start doing next week, you will realize that even the good kings are not all that good. The bad kings are extremely bad, but the good kings are not extremely good. They're kind of moderately good or partly good. There aren't any heroically good kings. Maybe Josiah, certainly the Reformation in England tried to push Josiah as being the anticipation of Edward VI. Um, and I have to say that, well, anyway, well, more about Edward VI when we get to Josiah. But it's not, even Josiah is not a universally desirable character in the book. So I would say it's definitely an apologetic on one level, but it's not an apologetic in the sense of being a whitewash. So, George Washington could not tell a lie, and couldn't cut down or did cut down a cherry tree, but couldn't tell a lie, and all that kind of stuff. It's not that kind of a picture, right? It's not Parson Weems on George Washington. Okay. Is this a patchwork made from earlier written sources? It certainly presents itself, it seems to me, as a patchwork of earlier written sources, in the same way that the books of Kings will too. The books of Kings is more insistent on that than the Samuel books are. If we discovered somehow exactly how this was put together and it turned out to be a patchwork from earlier written sources, that would be what I would expect. But if it turned out to be something else, then it might be a literary choice to make it look that way. It certainly, to me, in my mind, looks that way. Can the writing of the book be dated from internal evidence? As I tried to say at the beginning, one of the difficulties with dating from internal evidence is that, of course, every time these books are copied, they're written out again, so they can be altered in detail and on a large scale every single time they're copied. It's very difficult to date a book because of that. Some of the books chronicles Hebrew is clearly, even to my uneducated eye, later than the Hebrew of Exodus or something. But one of the difficulties about dating it from internal evidence, as we said last week, is that the text of the books of Samuel is famously corrupt. So it's very difficult to get an exact feel of what's going on because it's very choppy. So in terms of its choppiness and not being sort of neatly put together, it certainly looks more like a patchwork than it does. It's not a smooth literary creation in the way that Deuteronomy. See, Deuteronomy is a very smooth book. The books of Samuel are not. So they do seem patchy, if not patchworky, to me. How does the kingdom presented in the book, I'm at the very bottom of the page, relate to that which existed at the time? Can we distinguish skepticism from caution? 35 years ago this year, when I began Biblical Hebrew, which is not all that long ago, certainly in the scheme of things biblically, right? My Hebrew professor said to me once after class, you should know, Paul, that there has never been discovered any certain archaeological evidence of the existence of the Old Testament kingdoms. The kingdoms as they're presented in the Old Testament have never been, evidence has never been discovered. And I said, gee, I didn't know that because I'd never thought about it. I mean, I assumed that there was something. Since then, a number of things have been discovered that are at least close to that, if not that. If you turn over the page, the Tel Dan Stela, the Moabite Stone, and Shishak's topographical list, all of which, if you read any of these books, probably Kenneth Kitchen's, is the most obvious one, which is on an earlier list I sent you, which is the dependability of the Old Testament or something like that. And if you read Long Baker, if you read the historical history of Israel, which is Longman, Long, and Provane, they talk a lot about these things. The Moabite Stone is a Moabite monument by King Misha of Moab, boasting about how he beat the house of Omri in the northern kingdom, which is tremendously interesting because, of course, if you're going to boast and you're a king, the the value of boasting that you have conquered a kingdom that doesn't exist is minimum, right? If I became something that I guess in this election year is still possible, if I became the Emperor of North America, right, and I were going to put up those big, 300-foot tall heads of myself, like all those people in the Middle East put up, like huge, like Saddam Hussein heads and stuff, put up those big heads of myself, like Easter Island, all over the country, and boast about my conquests. I wouldn't boast. I haven't thought about this in great detail, right? But I wouldn't boast that I had conquered like Atlantis and Lilliput and other imaginary countries. I would boast that I'd conquered, I don't know, Canada and Mexico and maybe China on the West Coast where it might sell better, right? If you're a king and you're trying to make yourself look good politically at home and you boast about stuff, you boast about things that could, you might overplay your victory, like come back from the war in Europe and put up all these monuments about how your troops, defeated Hitler and they were the most important thing in the Second World War, even though, as a matter of fact, it turns out 9 of every 10 German soldiers killed in the war were killed by the Soviet army, right? Which is something that I only learned a few years ago, which makes the war in Europe seem quite different, though no better to go through. But anyway, you boast about fighting Hitler. You don't come back from the Second World War and talk about how you really whipped Napoleon. I mean, that's not going to impress anybody. So for Mesha, the king of Moab, to put up this Moabite monument called the Moabite Stone, because it's a big stone, and boast about conquering the house of Omri, it only makes sense if there is a house of Omri ruling the northern kingdom, right? The kingdom of Israel. Which means that in order for that to make any sense for Mesha, who's after all not buying into the Bible, right? Mesha's a pagan living in Moab, right? The only reason for him to do that would be that there was actually a kingdom that he had fought against and he could boast that he had beaten them. So that's a pretty good piece of evidence that there's actually something there. Shishak's topographical list, Shishak, who was a pharaoh of Egypt, has a list of all the people he's beaten up on, right? And one of the people in his list is Israel, which is really interesting because, again, if you're the pharaoh of Egypt and you're listing all the people you've beaten up on, and it's in the middle of it's in the middle of a list, and the other things in the list are real that historians know about, would you stick something that was not real in your list? First of all, how would it help the impressiveness of your list to stick in something that wasn't real? It wouldn't impress anybody who could read it, right? I am the great conqueror of France, Germany, Poland, Denmark, and Atlantis. That doesn't work. So there's real reason for thinking that the kingdom is a real thing. The question of how does the kingdom presented in the book relate to the kingdom which exists at the time, that's a question that we don't know enough to say anything intelligent about. As I began the course with, there's been some archaeological work done in Palestine. As a matter of fact, much more than there's been done anywhere else in the world because everybody's interested in Palestine. Archaeology is essentially a Western European, North American thing. If you're trying to raise money to dig, you can always get money from the general public for anything connected to the Bible. That's been true for all 100. Modern scientific archaeology is only from about 1900. Right? So for all 115 years of modern archaeology, you can always get money for archaeology if you can sell it as related to the Bible. People will give for that. It's very difficult to get money for archaeology for like ancient Greece or the Italian government will support some archaeology for ancient Rome, not nearly as much as you would think. They've already got so much stuff, they can't take care of what they've got. They don't really want more. But it's very difficult to, archaeology For all that you sort of hear about it when you study history, there's not as much archaeology done as people generally think there is. But what has been done fits pretty well with the way the kingdom looks in the book, a kind of mishmash of things that swirl back and forth. The kingdom grows and shrinks and grows and shrinks, and it's in some places and not others, and they fight with people very close to hand. That fits generally with what we know about the area archaeologically. Is it exactly the same? We don't know enough to know. But that's so that's inconclusive. But I would have to say that just in the 35 years since I started studying biblical Hebrew, the question has now completely changed. 35 years ago, as my professor, who was a very sane man who's got his PhD at the age of 21 from Johns Hopkins, was really a brilliant man, who relaxed by doing mathematical research. As someone who struggled desperately through math and made it through 11th grade math and then stopped, that's he's kind of like an alchemist as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, when someone like that was able to say, we need to remind ourselves that we really can't say that we know there ever was a kingdom, now you can't say that anymore. It seems perfectly clear from archaeology as well as from texts that there was a kingdom. What it was like, that's a completely different question. But the question, that if you know anything about history, ancient history, though, how does it fit with the written record question is almost always unanswerable in any ancient situation. So that doesn't mean that the Bible is less dependable than other stuff. The Bible's more checkable than most things we have from the ancient world, and it checks out very well. Okay. Those are general things. So can we distinguish skepticism from caution at the very bottom of the third page? Yes. I would say you would be skeptical if you would say, I don't believe there ever was a kingdom. I don't think you can say that responsibly anymore. 35 years ago, I did think you could say that. I didn't think it was true. I thought you couldn't know. Now I think it's pretty clear there was a kingdom that is reflected in the texts. But exactly how, the story of Bathsheba and David relates to the history, there's no place you can dig up anything that's going to prove to you the story of Uriah the Hittite. Archaeology just doesn't work that way, right? My wife is descended from Priscilla Mullins, who came over on the Mayflower, and there's no place you can go. I've been to Plymouth lots of times. I grew up there. There's no place you can go to Plymouth and learn anything about Priscilla Mullins. People know that you can go look at her gravestone, but it's just history doesn't work like that. Okay, so those are general points, but important points to make about these books. Let's say a few things about the notes in the middle of page 3. There are arguments for monarchy in this book, and there are arguments against monarchy. Look at the first argument for monarchy is 1 Samuel 8:5, and the argument against is 1 Samuel 8:7. They put them right next to each other. Let's read those two. Okay, when Samuel became old, I'll read you the whole beginning of the 8th chapter. He made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So even Samuel's kids grow up and go wrong. Mine haven't gone wrong yet, but there's plenty of time. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a judge to judge us like all the nations. A king to judge us like all the nations have, right? That's we want to, things are falling apart, we need a king. The thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they've rejected me from being king over them. The people are pro-king, and the Lord is anti-king. So who do you think's got the right of it in that circumstance? This is when the question of kings first comes up in the book, really in the Bible. This is when the question of a Jewish king, an Israelite king, first comes up, and the people are for it, and the Lord is against it, right? What does that say, first of all, about this as a whitewash of the house of David, who will be kings to the end of the kingdom? It's hard to present this book as a whitewash when the sinful people are for it and the Lord himself is against it. That's a very important thing. You could argue, and people have argued from that day till this, that the entire kingdom period is at a very basic level a rebellion against the Lord, because the people are not supposed to have any king except the Lord. Right? Of course, this is when those of us who belong to a Christian communion of the name of Christ the King fall into the sin of pride, right? Because we think, well, we know Christ is the only king, so. And then, of course, as soon as you think that, then you're right before your fall. But that certainly is the insight on which the name, or from which the name of our communion was chosen, right? So anyway, what does it mean to have both pro and con elements on the question of monarchy in the book? It means that this book is not a single-handed, one-way picture of even the general questions of what's going on in the life of Israel, right? Anti-Saul elements. 1 Samuel 10:22. I always feel sorry for Saul. Has a hard time of it, though he's not, of course. Right? Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near. This is verse 20. They're looking for the Lord's anointed. And the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans, and the clan of the Matrites was taken by Lot. And Saul the son of Kish was taken by Lot. But when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of the Lord, "Is there a man still to come?" And the Lord said, "Behold, he's hidden himself among the baggage." Saul, who is head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel, is hiding back with the luggage. Right? They ran and took him from there, and when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. Right? Saul is, even at the moment of being chosen, a chicken. I feel sorry for him. Okay, but here he is when he was introduced at the beginning of chapter 9. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjaminite, a man of wealth, a good background. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So Saul's an impressive guy. Does that make him more of a failure or less of a failure? Does it mean that he could have done a better job? Or the book does not say. Isn't that interesting? The book gives you both positive and negative things, tells the story, narrative theology, and the reader has to figure out how to put these pieces together. It's very possible to feel sorry for Saul, as I do, at the same time as thinking that he's, in the end, not all that good a guy. He does go crazy and try to kill David, which is a bad thing. But then, in the end, even David, whom he tries to kill, will not kill him, though he repeatedly has opportunities to do so, which is very interesting in a whole lot of ways. Okay, let's look at Joab, someone for whom I also have quite a bit of sympathy. Joab, pro and con. 2 Samuel 3:23 through 29. Is that right? Through 39. This is where he's going to murder Abner. Right? When Joab and all the army that was with him came, it was told Joab, "Abner the son of Ner." Abner means my father is Ner. So Abner the son of Ner is like my father is Ner the son of Ner. Came to the king, and he has let him go, and he's gone in peace. Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why is it you've sent him away so that he's gone? You know that Abner the son of Ner came to deceive you and to know you're going out and you're coming in, to know all that you're doing." Remember, Abner had killed his brother. Anyway, when Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner. They brought him back from the cistern of Sirah. David didn't know about it. When Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the midst of the gate to speak with him privately. "Come on over here," and struck him in the stomach, so he died, for the blood of Asahel, his brother, who was the fast runner. Right? Murders him for it's like that scene in Lawrence of Arabia where the Arab army is going to fall apart because of a vengeance feud. And that's exactly what this is. The kingdom could be torn apart by this vengeance feud. So that's a con. Let's look at 2 Samuel 11:14-25. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, who was commanding the army, and this is when he's going to murder Uriah, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting and draw back from him so he may be struck down and die." He assigned Uriah in the place where he knew there were valiant men, and sends the message, "Your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead." So he was an obedient servant. It's interesting. I've, of course, read these notes before. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be a pro-Joab or a negative Joab. It seems to me, if you're Joab, you know what the king is trying to do. Is it good if you obey the king and put Uriah where you know he's going to be killed? Or is it bad if you obey the king and put Uriah where you know he's going to be killed? That's a moral, that now you're in the Nazi trials at the end of the Second World War. Are you allowed to follow orders, or are you supposed to not follow orders? And anyway, for pro-Absalom, let's look for him rebuking David when when David is mourning. Here, that's chapter 19 in 2nd, which is interesting. I don't have that listed as a Joab pro con. I wonder why not. I guess it's their lists from Matthews and Moyer. But I think when I think of Joab, when I think of a pro Joab thing, this is the pro Joab thing that comes to my mind. It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." Chapter 19, 2 Samuel. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, "The king is grieving for his son." And the people stole into the city that day, as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." Joab came into the house to the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants who have this day saved your life, and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." The king arose and took his seat in the gate. He acknowledges the correctness of Joab's rebuke. And the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate," and all the people came before the king and saw that he was there. Right? So is this a pro-Joab book or an anti-Joab book? I would argue that it's a recounting of the various kinds of things that Joab did. Joab, a tremendously important figure. Not all pro, not all con, most likely because Joab was not all pro and not all con, right? So the the book, I think, is theologically, because after all, the word of the Lord trumps everything, right? So in terms of monarchy, the book must be anti-monarchy, generally speaking, right? Is it anti-Saul? Is it pro-Saul? I say it's depicting Saul. Is it anti-Joab, pro-Joab? I say depicting Joab. Is it anti-David, pro-David? I say depicting David. And, well, we don't quite get to Solomon yet, but, I mean, he's kind of entering stage left. But we'll find that the Book of Kings doesn't think that Solomon is, always exactly right. Let's look quickly at prophetic and poetic. Prophetic speeches, 1 Samuel 2:27 to 36. It is worth noting that though almost all of this book is history in the sense that we would regularly use it, right? Record of events, that the Lord is an actor in the book. After all, in some ways, he's the first actor in the book. He gives Samuel to Hannah, right? And so prophecy, speaking on behalf of the Lord among the people, is not something which should be completely unexpected. There came a man of God to Eli and said to him, Thus says the Lord. This is chapter 2, verse 27 in the first book. Thus says the Lord, Did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded, and honor your sons above me, by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every... he's rebuking Eli for making a business out of the offering of sacrifices to the Lord. So the Lord is not just kind of implicitly off stage seeing how people are doing. The Lord enters the story through his prophet, the man of God, and rebukes Eli to try to get him to change the way he is, right? So the Lord is not just favoring people when they deserve it and not favoring them when they don't. He's actively trying to get them to do the right thing so he can favor them, which is, of course, an act of grace, right? He gives Hannah the gift of a son so she can respond with her song, which is an act of great piety and righteousness. Okay, and lastly, the prophetic, the poetic passages. We already read two of them, so we don't need to look at that again. But we have 2 more minutes. Let's just think about that. The Jewish tradition remembers David primarily as the psalm writer, and only secondarily as a king. In the tradition's view, his work as a creator of traditional worship songs and as a great worshiper of the Lord is the most important thing about him. So the fact that there is a Psalm of David in the book of Samuel is very important. It's presenting David as the historical record has him. He is a man of action, but he is also a singer of psalms and a writer of psalms. After all, he does that, before the face of Saul, when Saul throws the spear and tries to kill him twice, right? At least we're told it twice. So the Lord is active both inside the story and as a judge of the story. The children of Israel respond to the Lord, worship the Lord with poetic passages, the way they do also in the New Testament, right? This, it's important to see when you open a prophetic work, which is largely poetry, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, um, Amos. These books are mostly poetic, right? That poetic speaking to the Lord and from the Lord to the people is something which is in the historical record, in the book of Samuel. So the prophetic books are not a completely weird thing coming in from left field. They are a focusing on a particular element of the relationship between the Lord and his people, right? The man of God comes and speaks to Eli, right? In a few verses, and then the story goes on. In the book of Amos, Amos comes to speak to the people in the northern kingdom, and that's the whole book, right? David sings a psalm, Hannah sings a song, and then we have a whole book of Psalms, right? And this kind of relationship continues, as we said, even in the New Testament, where Luke in particular is very interested in the songs that come out of the life of Christ. So we're done with the books of Samuel. You're not allowed to have favorite books of the Bible because it's all God's Word, but I really like the books of Samuel. I really think they have wonderful things in them. Next week we begin on the books of the Kings, and I look forward to doing that with you then. Thank you for watching.